From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. As you can see, it is Monday, May the 9th. If it's your birthday, your horoscope says this month should be emotionally varied, and your problems seem to involve communication. If you're President Reagan, you may wish you'd never heard of horoscopes or astrologers or Donald T. Reagan. It is today that the former White House Chief of Staff's book is officially published, containing all the details about the first family's reliance on astrology. The revelations have already led to criticism and jokes at the president's expense. But as we've seen in the past, Mrs. Reagan is not easily deterred. Sam Donaldson reports that the White House will not take the Reagan book lying down.
With Reagan's book now out and selling, revealing as it does that Nancy Reagan consults an astrologer about the president's schedule, San Francisco's Joan Quigley.
And I'm a very modern scientific astrologer.
The White House sought to counterattack. Presidential spokesman Fitzwater denouncing Reagan for seeking to exploit the presidency for personal self-interest. The president himself denied the story at one point when asked if he would continue to allow astrology to play a part in his scheduling.
I can't, because I never did.
But later, aides said he had misunderstood the question, and in fact, Mrs. Reagan is still consulting an astrologer, and they expect she will continue to do so. There's nothing wrong with that, said press spokesman Fitzwater. But in an interview today with columnist Carl Rowan, the president denied other Reagan allegations.
Well, his reaction is that Don Reagan has written what he calls a bunch of falsehoods. He claims, for example, that Mrs. Reagan never asked him to fire former CIA Director Casey. He says Mrs. Reagan didn't fire Reagan.
Reagan, in his book, says Mrs. Reagan asked him, not her husband, to fire Casey as Casey lay hospitalized. And Mrs. Reagan's hand in getting rid of Reagan is widely known. Mrs. Reagan issued a statement of her own today, saying it's come through to me that Don Reagan doesn't really like me. Aides said she is very upset. Reagan, continuing his round of book interviews, was asked about that.
I couldn't describe that. I haven't talked to her.
As for the president himself, Reagan says in his book it was a rare meeting in which Mr. Reagan made a decision or issued orders. Reagan said in 4 years as Treasury Secretary, he never saw the president alone. He was content to exercise the symbolic powers of his office, said Reagan. This unflattering portrait of the first family by Reagan is producing new, often humorous, unfavorable public reaction, which political opponents are clearly savoring.
The public is the one who's got the jokes and is spreading the jokes. It's not the Democrats.
Reagan loyalists are incensed.
He was arrogant, he was incompetent, and I think that some of his disclosures in this book are just vindictive.
Reporters like Helen Thomas are just glad to be informed.
I've never shunned away from information. History's our business, and we write it every day.
Presidents and their wives look to their place in history. And for the Reagans, Reagan's book doesn't help. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
In Mr. Reagan's book about Mr. Reagan, he makes the point that the president was reluctant to fire him in person. And if you remember, it took a long time and a lot of pressure before Mr. Reagan cut Mr. Reagan loose in the first place, which raises this question. If the president is as loyal to people who work for him as he clearly is, how is it that he doesn't engender greater loyalty in them? Here's ABC's Jeff Greenfield.
Now let's see. The former chief of staff says the president's wife's astrologer friend controlled the schedule. The former budget director said the president didn't understand many of the numbers. His longtime image maker wrote the president was often out of touch with reality, and the former press spokesman revealed he made up presidential quotes.
In tonight's Money Matters on Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials lost about 10 points. They slipped back under the 2,000 mark, and the trading was moderate. Robert Heinlein, who's often called the most important science fiction writer since H.G. Wells, has died at his home in California. His novel, Stranger in a Strange Land, is a science fiction classic. Mr. Heinlein was 80. When we come back, the Danish election and what the effect may be on the Western alliance.